Thanks very much. Thanks, Jean. Thanks, Bob. Good evening, everybody. My name's Owen Green. I currently work at the Department of Earth Sciences, the University of Oxford. I'm a laboratory manager here, so one of the support people looking after various research projects. This will probably be the last talk that I will give, which I can actually use the University of Oxford logo, as I will be retiring at the end of July this year. But at the moment, yes, I'm still in the department. I'm also currently the chair of the Oxfordshire Geology Trust. So we are the conservation group that looks after SSSIs and local LGSs around the county. And of course, one of them is the William Smith Monument in Churchill. Currently where I live, it's about 2 miles away from the village of Churchill. So I have done quite a lot of work with the local group over there that runs the Sarsden and Churchill Heritage Centre, which has a superb display. But I'll show you some images of that later on. So without further ado, I might as well kick off then with William Strata Smith, Colouring the Landscape. So I'm going to talk a bit about his life, the legacy, and his contribution to geological sciences. I'll try and explain the science that is important and relates to his life, but I'll hopefully make it so it's understandable to everyone. So you may have read something or know something about William Smith. These are the two main sort of books which came out in 2001. One of them, The Map That Changed the World, really sort of brought William Smith to a greater, wider audience. Less well known is John Morton's book, which was out in the same year. Simon Winchester, of course, is a well-known author and writes in a lovely sort of flowing way. So it's a very readable book. It was also serialized on Radio 4 as well. So you may well have come across both of these books. One thing to say about them is, of course, published in 2001. They were sort of researched at a time before that the World Wide Web was really used in a huge big way. So both of these authors are actually having to painstakingly go through library and museum records to get the information they want. So let's just kick off straight away with what William Smith is known for. And this is his map. On the right-hand side, we have the map that was prepared by William Smith in 1815. And on the left-hand side is the current sort of British Geological Survey map. Straight away, you can instantly see that there are similarities between them. Some of the fine detail is obviously missing on Smith's map. But I think the take-home point here is that William Smith was just one person working on this map. The BGS is a government organization, and since it was set up in 1835, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have contributed to the bedrock geology map of the United Kingdom. The other thing that is really evident between the two is the colouring of them. William Smith was one of the first person to really use colouring on geological maps to show the different stratas. And you can see that a lot of the colours that he used in 1815 have actually still sort of in current use today on geological maps. So that older rocks, Paleozoic rocks, which you get, say, in Wales, are usually always this purple colour, whereas the Cretaceous chalk of eastern England is nearly always shown as a green colour. Okay, so this is William Smith, father of geology. This is a very famous portrait of him that is now hanging in Burlington House in London, which is the home of the Geological Society. This was painted obviously towards the end of his life, but is you can just imagine a broad sort of Cotswold accent coming out of this gentleman. Also within the picture in Burlington House, there is actually a lock of William Smith's hair, which was taken from his body just after he died. So it's come all the way from Northampton down to London. Okay, so what am I going to try and cover tonight? I'm going to put William Smith's life in context. So he's obviously born in the 18th century, worked in the 19th century. So we're going to look at some of the key people that influenced William Smith, his very varied professional life that he had. As you can see here, canal builder, land drainer, sea defense engineer, fossil collector, mineral surveyor, map maker. All of these were sort of titles that Smith used. He never actually called himself a geologist at all. And we'll look at some of the legacy of William Smith as well and what's around today. So at the time of Smith's birth, this is really what was happening in the world and in the country. He was born at the start of what is really the commercial industrial revolution that was sweeping across Europe, and of course obviously centered on Great Britain at that time. At the year of his birth, we had this steam tractor that was used by the French military. Captain Cook was landing and discovering New Zealand. James Watt was patenting his improved steam engine, while Richard Arkwright was then developing the spinning frame. So all huge, big developments, industrial developments. The stock exchange was founded just after Smith was born. So that again forms a very important part of the backbone of our economy at the moment. So really this country was going through this transformation with the start of the Industrial Revolution, but there was also an agricultural revolution going on at the same time. So land use was changing, the act of enclosures was coming into being as well, and so we're going through this time when crop rotation is now kicking off and starting. So moving away from subsistence farming to actually intensive industrial farming as well. Better animal husbandry was going on. So animals weren't just being bred to be slaughtered to keep families going during the year. There was this huge change happening at the same time in both commerce, mechanization, and obviously transport as well. This little diagram shows you sort of the enclosure acts that is going on, the development of transportation system throughout the country, development of roads, and of course the canals as well, being the rise of them up to the start of 1800. And then their decline as railways come in just after Smith has died. And the other thing that's indicated at the very bottom of the map is when we were at war with our neighbors in France, of course, these conflicts actually act to sort of increase, development and mechanization, which was going on all at the same time. So life in 18th century England. So we had a population of about 6.5 million when Smith was being born, and rising to about 9 million in about 1800. So there's this move away from an agricultural sort of existence to becoming more urbanized as people were moving there to occupy these new jobs that were being introduced. And then, as I say, there was also this huge change going on in the agricultural side of things. So let's just have a quick look at where William Smith was born. This is in the village of Churchyard. So on the left-hand side, we've got a picture of where his house would have stood, the house that he was born in. That's long gone. And then on the right-hand side, after Smith's father had died, his mother remarried, and she married the landlord of the Chequers. The Chequers pub still exists in Churchill, so for any sort of budding, geologists, it's a place of pilgrimage to go to, and anyone who's really interested in William Smith, you do not have to feel guilty going into a public house, raising a glass to the great man. I'm sure the floor level of the pub has changed considerably in that time, but it's still nice to think you're in the same space that William Smith may well have walked through. Around his where his house was, there's now a plaque of Yorkshire limestone that has been put there. This was put in 2015 when we were commemorating the 200 years of the map, and it was unveiled by Professor Hugh Torrens, who's another Smith enthusiast and has published quite a lot on him. So what did Smith do? Well, when he was very young, he was very interested in collecting the odd fossils. When his father had died, he'd moved to the farm in Over Norton, which is about 3 miles away from Churchill, where he was with his uncle, and commonly found in the fields around this part of West Oxfordshire is this sea urchin, Clypeus plotti, named after the very famous chemist who did one of the early natural history descriptions of Oxfordshire. And then also these little terebratulids, brachiopods, which are also found, known as pundibs in Smith's time. And the young kids used to sort of have this game, using them very much like marbles, playing this game with them. And the Clypeus, also known as pound stones, because they were used by the milkmaids to help measure out butter. So his early life, after his education, he was in the local area, and the lands were being surveyed by a gentleman called Edward Webb, who was based in Stow-on-the-Wold, and he needed an assistant, and Smith was considered both intelligent enough and enthusiastic enough to be taken on as Edward Webb's sort of apprentice. And so he moved from Churchill and lodged with Webb in Stow-on-the-Wold at the Manor House. There's a picture of the Manor House now around the front. It is it's an art gallery, but there is this very well-known or famous L.F. Lowry pencil drawing of the building there. And in 2009, there was a plaque unveiled there to commemorate sort of Smith's geological map of Britain. This is quite interesting, really. I'm going to show you quite a few of the plaques which commemorate Smith in various places of his life. And it's quite amusing that there are all these sort of mistakes actually on the plaques. So Smith never actually did a geological map of Britain. It's actually titled A Map of England and Wales and Part of Scotland. So, it's just a minor point, but there's quite a lot of these that will come up. While it was also just in Churchill, just down the road, and in fact, Warren Hastings, who was the first Governor General of India, was also born in the village of Churchill. So if you do visit the village, we have these two very famous sons who were born there. And Hastings had returned from India, retired, if you like, and was going to try and repurchase the family home because his mother had died in childbirth. His father, who was a man of the cloth, had completely, had disappeared when he'd gone sort of abroad and was never heard of again. So Smith was sort of Hastings was brought up as this orphan. You may also know that he was one of the few people to be tried in the House of Commons. It was an embezzlement sort of trial, with trumped up charges done by people who didn't really like or agree with him. I think the trial lasted about 8 years, but he was eventually acquitted. But there is this comment that Smith, when they were with Webb actually looking at the garden and landscaping that he records meeting this the gouty great man who sat on his horse with his livery servant behind him. So they did overlap. I shouldn't think Hastings actually spoke to Smith, but anyway, there is a connection between the two. So Webb was obviously so impressed by Smith that he sent him down to Somerset to look at the estate of Mary Jones, John Strachey's niece. When she died, this estate was taken over by her second cousin. And at this time, they were sort of, most of these estates, they were prospecting for the mineral rights and certainly looking for things like coal that might be in the local vicinity. So Smith was sent down there, and there's quite a tenuous sort of story between Smith and Strachey. Who was John Strachey? He was a very early geologist, actually a pioneer geologist who recognized strata as layered rocks which encompass the earth. And he'd seen quite a few of these on his travels round the country. And he did this wonderful sort of map. He'd recognized that a lot of the strata dips towards the southeast, which is commonly observed today, even in this country. And so he came up with this theory that actually a section through the earth it was a bit like a Catherine wheel with everything dipping towards the south. And he identified, I think 12 discrete sort of layers with the chalk at the top and the limestones, the carboniferous limestones at the base of this unit. How do we know that William Smith might have viewed this? Well, there is one particular diagram that was found in the Smith's archives, and it's actually from a work by John Strachey, but it's actually been annotated by William Smith. So clearly when he was down in Somerset, he did actually see and look at and observe and begin to understand what was happening with some of the strata below surface. He lodged down there in Somerset and had obviously come to the attention of some of the people who were actually wanting to build canals in the area, because canals were the main way that you could actually transport and get coal out of there to the main industrial centres in the Midlands. So he was taken on by the Somerset Coal Canal people, and in doing that he actually managed to undertake this tour around the country where they're inspecting some of the canals and mines around there. So again, adding to Smith's sort of knowledge of what was happening. And he was tasked with sort of excavating and building the Somerset Coal Canal. So it's actually two branches of a canal that join up, and Smith was able, when they were excavating these, to recognize some of the strata and the fossils that were found in the strata. Sadly, this is what the canal looks like today, so it's virtually completely dry. But there is still this sort of, remnant of this lock sequence there. And it was at this time as well that Smith was beginning to understand that fossils were actually incredibly useful And he recognized that most people who were actually finding fossils were just thinking of them as curiosities, really, and didn't have any scientific value at all, or any value, and that people weren't really taking it seriously and looking at how these were found either in the strata. So he writes this sort of paragraph out, which you have to read about 2 or 3 times to just sort of get a grasp of what he's saying there. But essentially what he's saying is, you know, we don't give them, they're not admired as much as even like a child's rattle or hobby horse, but actually people are just sort of not really grasping how these particular entities are actually very, very useful. So it was while he was down here that he actually stayed at a cottage, Tucking Mill Cottage near Midford. And again, in the 1800s, the Bath Natural History and Antiquarian Society thought it was quite important that a plaque should be placed on Tucking Mill. And the black and white image at the top right, you can see the plaque is just off to the right-hand side. But the mill was actually pulled down and demolished. So the Geological Society thought it would be a good idea to then place this on Tucking Mill Cottage, which they did. So that's on the left-hand upper image there. And you can see that there's this is the inscription of it down at the bottom right. And it was only in the 1970s that Joan Iles, the late Joan Iles, who was possibly the country's leading Smith expert at the time, she looked at some of the parish maps and boundaries and recognized that actually the plaque had been placed on the wrong building. And it should have been on this one at the bottom left here. This is actually Tucking Mill, which is nowhere near as nice as the building at the top. But that was actually the building that Smith had purchased, or Smith had rented and was living in at the time. And he begins to sort of get to this idea of this, that strata can now be defined by the fossil assemblages that you're getting in there. And this is one of his main observations at the time. And he just sort of praises the great creator, how he's assigned each class to a particular stratum. So he's the first person to make this observation. And in doing so, he used to confide in the company of these 2 gentlemen of the cloth, the Reverend Joseph Townsend and Benjamin Richardson. And then while they were in Bath in June, he actually dictated to them a list of strata around Bath. And again, so there's a plaque on the house there, but again, if you look carefully, you'll see that the date on it is December 1799 and not June. But this was a very important point that Smith had come up with, and that both Richardson and Townsend thought that this should be recorded and should be actually made more widely available. And it leads really nicely into Smith's sort of 2 basic laws, which he came up with. And these are, if you like, effectively part of the science bit, but they're quite easy to understand. So the first one is his principle of superposition of strata, and this is based on the law that had been developed by Nicholas Steno, which essentially says that the older the rocks are, they will be at the bottom, younger rocks will be at the top, unless you can demonstrate that they've been overturned and the succession has been reversed in some way. So this is where you get sort of structural folding or whatever coming in and faulting. So that's his first law. The second law that he came up with is that he identified that fossils can be confined to a distinct bed or group of beds. in any particular succession. And so you're getting distinctive fossil assemblages. And this allows you to actually map these horizons of strata. They can be correlated over wide geographical areas just by looking at the particular fossil assemblage that's in there. So these are two important laws. There's still two very, very fundamental laws which are taught to every geological student in every university when they're going to undertake their own sort of independent mapping project. And just to illustrate certainly the first law, so here we've got two localities sort of left and right here shown with fossils confined to particular beds. And if you trace them across a geographical area from left to right, you'll see that some of the beds are not recorded and not present. And this is actually what you find in the natural environment. But it's also compounded by the fact that you've got topography being introduced. So you can imagine that if you've got, say, 3 rivers in these valleys sort of eroding out, and that perhaps some of your strata does not extend across the whole of the range. So you can see that strata B on the left-hand side of the image doesn't extend right across to location 4. It's going to be pinched out in that time. And this again is another important point. And Smith managed to demonstrate this to both Richardson and Townsend when he used a map, a tourist map of Bath. And so on the right-hand side, we've got one of the versions, and there are many versions of this map around. And you can see there's some sort of lines marked on there, and these are actually in different colors. But the left-hand map is a digitally enhanced version of that. It's been prepared by Caroline Lamb of the Geological Society. And you can easily see on there that there are sort of 3 colors used. And what Smith would do, they would stand one side of the valley and he would predict to Townsend and Johnson what would be found on the other side of the valley, and then they'd ride over there and have a look at this and be sort of amazed that he could actually predict what was going to be on the hill on the other side. So that's again one of the perhaps one of the first geological maps to actually be produced. Now, if I look, we fast forward to his final map, you can see that this is from the 1815 map, that around the Bath area, there is an awful lot of detail relating the different topography to the different stratas that he's going to, that are encountered in that area. So Smith needs to carry on doing this work and travel around, but in 1799 he is dismissed by the Somerset Canal Company from his employment there. But bizarrely, it's the chair of the SCC actually employs Smith to drain his farmland. So his reputation as being a land drainer is also incredibly important to him, and this enables him to actually earn a living and sort of continue his travels and getting his, if you like, building on this data set that he's seen while he was actually a canal engineer. It also means that he's comes to the attention of people like Thomas William Coke from Holcombe Hall fame up in North Norfolk, my home county. And so he becomes goes up to Norfolk and helps drain some of the lands, which are the streams which are flowing into the north of the Norfolk coast. And this means he also, in fact, if we look at this is Holcombe Hall, which many of you may have been to, and the monument at the bottom picture, far in the distance there is a frieze around the bottom of it, which may well contain a person who might well B. William Smith, shown with a leveling stick, and it's quite interesting. One of the, this is how important he was. He also came to the attention of this man. This is Francis Russell, better known as the Duke of Bedford, who resides in Woburn Abbey. And again, Coke and Bedford compete with each other in actually having these sheep sharing events, like the modern day sort of agricultural shows we've got here. And this is a very famous engraving taken of the Duke of Bedford sitting on the centre on his horse, surrounded by all the local gentry and everyone who's interested in sheep and the like. And on this particular engraving, everyone is numbered on there who's important, and William Smith is actually numbered as number 10, and he's right over on the left-hand side of the image at the very back. It is, again, a support player on what's happening here, but considered important enough to be included in this. And while he's sort of working up in Bedfordshire, he does a lot of these drainage of water meadows, which were very, very common. So these were areas which could then increase their agricultural value to communities. And Smith gets involved with a lot of these sort of projects as well. And in 1801, he's actually, there's his earliest surviving geological map, which is going to form the basis of what he's going to be sort of working on for the next 15 years. But just sort of going down what he was doing in at this time, between 1802 and 07, he spends many months in Norfolk working on drainage systems there. He undertakes various work in Yorkshire when they're sinking boreholes, again, looking for coal. He's obviously financially, quite prosperous at this time because he rents offices in Trimbridge in Bath, and also a residence in the Strand in London. But he also tries to influence people, members of the Geological Society, which had been founded in 1807. And he has a collection of fossils there and invites them round to have a look at them. And of course, all the Geological Society bigwigs are just not impressed at all with what he's done and sort of dismiss it, which is a real shame. But I guess one of the most important things he did was restoring the hot springs in Bath, which had been completely sort of overcome with debris being thrown in there. Smith managed to clear it, and of course the springs are now incredibly important to Bath today. So up in Norfolk, there's a major project that he's involved with, and that actually revolves around the Sea Breach Act of 1610, whereby the sea, high tides invades into many parishes in Norfolk and some in Suffolk. You will know these today as the Broads of Norfolk. But at the time when Smith was going there, he was reporting that, that things could be done to help ensure that the sea did not encroach upon the land anymore. And one of the things he did was to build up the dunes, the natural dunes there. So rather than using a lot of physical, bringing rocks in or whatever, he actually constructed these dunes and then had marram grass sort of planted on them. And that just sort of kept the sea at bay, and as it did for many years. And it was only major floods, like the 1952, 53 floods that they had in Norfolk that were a big problem. And it's at this time that he's now sort of getting the ideas of his base map, and sort of having a base map which is going to show the geology. And this is the technical side of it, if you like. You need a very good map engraver to do this. And he entered into this partnership with John Carey, the very famous London map engraver, who was doing a lot of the Ordnance Survey maps when the survey came into existence. And he agreed to publish Smith's maps on this scale of 5 miles to the inch. And so he did these engravings, and then Smith added his famous geological lines. And then in 1815, you had this huge map completed. 23 different stratas were shown on there in 21 different colors. And he used this deeper shade of the coloring down at the base of the exposures. And apparently there were about 200 copies of the map were produced. There was an accompanying memoir to go with them, but fewer than 100 are known to exist today, of which there are actually quite a few here in Oxford. There is one sort of not more than about 100 meters away from me at the moment in the Department of Geography. And there are some very nice maps in the museum, the Natural History Museum, one of which is sort of bound as a book. So the colors on it are absolutely amazing. It's hardly seen the light of day. Really is worth having a look. And of course, with every good map, you need a key to go with it. And Smith did this explanation key and colored it in exactly the same way as he did his map. So that was all going to make sense to everyone. This is what the map actually looks like. It's in these 15 sheets with this 51-page memoir, which describes the strata in the various areas. And it was issued in a number of forms, rolled up and as a book form as well. And he dedicated it to one of his great supporters, who was Joseph Banks. At the time, Joseph Banks had been a big supporter of William Smith. And so he gets a mention actually on the map. One of the things that also Smith did was to draw a section. So you can draw a map which is showing you the surface expression of the rocks, but any geologist will say it's actually the section through the map which will show you what's happening below the surface. So this is the actual little succession of strata that Smith had, and again you'll see it's dipping. So we've got Wales over here on the left-hand side, Thames, Vale of Thames on the right-hand side. So this is where our section is going from, and our strata is all dipping towards the southeast. Smith also then went around adding together with the list of strata, but he also added onto it this annotated legend with all the fossils that he was finding. So essentially bringing his second law into his map, in saying that actually with all of the strata that you've got, oldest at the bottom in this colored section, youngest at the top, and then on the right-hand side, you've got the various fossil assemblages that he would have recognized. He then drew a lot of the fossils and did these superb drawings of them. And you'll notice that they're on colored paper. So he actually, again, colored the paper to relate to the particular strata that he was looking at. Now, some of these fossils still exist today, and there has been, and I'll show it to you later, a memoir which has now photographed a lot of the fossils, and it is a really nice addition to anyone's Smith library that they're putting together. So part 1 and 2 came out in 1816. In 1817, he did part 3 of it. And again, this was all being promoted by by this gentleman, William Henry Fitton, who was a geologist who recognized what Smith was doing and thought it should be brought to the attention of the wider scientific community. So again, trying to help elevate Smith's reputation. Smith, meanwhile, had sort of gone ahead and did this huge sort of sections he was doing across the country. So there's what, 5 or 6 different sections here, various parts of the country, again, showing you what's happening subsurface with a lot of the strata. He then turned his attention to doing these county maps. And here's the one of Oxfordshire. 21 of them were published between 1819 and 1824. Sadly, Northamptonshire was one which you can see here is coloured. It was almost completed by Smith. And what a very, very clever company has done now is they've done what they called the map that might have been. In other words, they've taken all the county maps that Smith put together, and they've sort of generated this map of what might have been, and then they've digitally incorporated some of the later versions. I'll show you the website that this is on altogether. It's stitched them all together to show you what Smith's final map may well have been like. So he was really working on this all during his life. But of course, he didn't get it all his own way. This gentleman came along, George Bellis Greenough, who was the first president of the Geological Society of London. And he thought they could do a better job than William Smith. And of course, he's quite right. When you get a group of people working together, so there's a little bit of Greenoff's map down from down in Cornwall, and the detail on there is incredible. Is certainly more than what William Smith could have done at the time. But when this map was published in 1819, so just 3 years after Smith's map, and of course, it meant then that there was competition to Smith's map, and this one sort of, if you like, won the day. There is a memoir to go with it, which is absolutely useless, because all it contains is a list of what the highest points are in each of the counties that it covers. It contains no geological information at all, really, certainly no description of the strata, which is all the hard work that William Smith had put together. But again, there are copies of this map available as well. So a fourth part of the fossil sort of descriptions came out, but this also coincided at the time that Smith spent some time in the King's Bench prison, debtor's prison. He was forced to sell his property down in Somerset and was evicted from his place in London. And it was a really sad time. Obviously, a lot of his papers were lost and destroyed at the time. But on his release from it, he then left London, never to really return again to it, and took up residence in Yorkshire. He did, however, have one more map that was produced and got a lot of sort of critical acclaim. And this map is a much smaller map, but it does contain things like the sort of mines that are found on there, and sort of coal. It's actually designed, if you like, for engineers to use this map. Again, copies of this can be obtained from the BGS. They have this map produced as well, say much smaller, and also includes the geology of Ireland now, or at least the east coast of Ireland, which hadn't been on his original map, and extends a little bit further into Scotland. But a lot of the detail there is not as good as it was, as it should be. So what happened up in Yorkshire? Well, this is again an area that you may well have seen. If you've ever been to Scarborough, you may well have visited the rotunda museum, which is up there. So this was actually designed by William Smith and his then nephew, John Phillips. And they did lecture tours around the county. They also did maps when he was up there as well, because he was employed by Sir John Johnson on his estate at Hackness to actually map the area. Then again, essentially doing mineral prospecting up there. And of course, he lived in Scarborough, and there is the plaque up there. And this one sort of, it's not too bad actually, is it? William Smith lived here, 1835 to 1839. And he lived in this particular street, Huntress Row, which is just in the centre of Scarborough. Number 2 Huntress Row is where he lived. So what did they do with the blue plaque? They put it on the neighbouring street, Bar Street. So it's actually in the back of the building. So yeah, it's sort of roughly in the right area, which is particularly good. Let's have a look at John Phillips. So his nephew, again, anyone who has visited the Natural History Museum in Oxford, the superb building there, this is really the both the brainchild and very much sort of under sort of what Phillips thought should be in a museum, not just a place for displaying things. So the whole building has got these superb pillars around there, all of the different rocks that he'd collected or had come across, a lot from Ireland, actually, and a lot from southern England. Phillips actually did the biography of Smith. He was professor of geology at Oxford as well, and keeper of the museum, Natural History Museum, that is there as well. This is a facsimile of the memoirs of William Smith, which was done by John Phillips. And of course, it's one of the main sources of information that was known about Phillips before, if you like, everything became available on the web. Less known, but perhaps an equally important paper is this one from 1917 by Tom Shepherd. He was one of the first people in the 20th century to actually try and analyze Smith's work. And it is a really incredible sort of piece of work that he put together. He certainly explored a lot of what Smith's life and tried to get a lot of the information that was not known about Smith at the time. Now, I just thought I'd bring in this particular thing. So there are Smith archives now, which are actually in the Oxford Museum of Natural History. So these were sort of rediscovered in 1939, 1940, when the attic of the museum had to be cleared because they thought there was a potential fire risk going on there. So this task was undertaken by 2 people who'd been at the university for quite some time, the departmental technician, Herbert Hambidge, and the demonstrator, Bazand. They found this box of papers in the top. This was reported in actually in Nature in 1940, and L.R. Cox, famous geologist, also gave a talk on this, and sort of said it was found by the then head of department, which I'm sure it was, but they thought it had lain undisturbed since the death of John Phillips in 1874. And the documents were sort of catalogued together, and there was meant to be a display case for them. As far as I know, no one really knows what happened to the display case, but of course all the documents which were originally in the Department of Earth Sciences were then moved over to the Natural History Museum. Cox did this paper in 1940, which sort of was the first time someone had actually analysed and looked at some of the papers there. But there's so much to look at. He obviously couldn't look at everything. So now let's have a little look, and this is really for Bob, because he said, how many times did Smith go back to Churchill? So here we go. This is all the trips that Smith made back to Churchill. Not very many, actually. He invariably visited, because he was obviously visiting his family, his brother Daniel, because he invariably owed Daniel money. And he then came back, obviously, when both his uncle, who had sort of raised him for a bit, and his mother, when they both passed away. And then in 1808, this was really the interesting time. Daniel invites his widowed sister, Elizabeth, and her four children to stay with him in Churchill. However, she dies in July of that year, and when Smith visits, he discusses the family finances with him. He then returns and sells all the family ancestral home to his stepfather, Robert Gardner, pays off all his outstanding debts, which at that time totaled £155, 11 shillings and sixpence, which is in today's money probably quite a few thousand, actually. But when he departed from Churchill, then he took with him his nephew, John Phillips, who was sort of 8 years old at the time, and never really came back anymore, except later on he visited when sort of towards the end of his life, when he came back to see Daniel, and met up again with Edward Webb. And after discussions with the squire there, James Langston, he was commissioned to drain a small water meadow. And this is still, we think we've got the position of this in the River Sar as to where it was. It only took him 3 weeks to do this project, so not a particularly big project. And then his final visit was in December of that year, when he celebrated the New Year with his brother. One of the things we've never been able to find is his uncle's farmhouse in Over Norton. We've never been able to track that down, and local historians have looked through the parish registers, but can't work out exactly which one it is. Anyway, getting back to Smith's life, getting towards the end now, as you all know, he received the Wollaston Medal when he visited and received that in the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford. This was presented in 1831 by Adam Sedgwick to him, who in his address to Smith, this is where he calls him the father of English geology. And of course, other notable recipients of that medal included John Phillips as well. Someone else you might have heard of, William Buckland, who was one of the first readers of geology at Oxford, Joseph Prestwich, another famous sort of geologist who did an awful lot on the drainage and sewerage systems around the city. And Adam Sedgwick himself received it, as did William Fitton, who we'd met before. So in his final years, he got this degree conferred upon him from Trinity College Dublin, which is where John Phillips had been the professor for a while before he moved here. He was then took an active part on the committee that toured England looking for a suitable rock for the new Houses of Parliament. And of course, anyone who's followed the news will know that there has been documentaries on how the Houses of Parliament are currently in a great state of decay. So whether or not we should thank William Smith for that, I'm not quite sure. You would also know, again, I'm preaching to people who know this, that he caught this chill when he was going through Northampton and died there the age of 70. And you know exactly this beautiful engraving here that was put up in the local church. And of course the grave there, and this the nice photograph that Jean has just sent me as well. But there's other legacy and links to explore here as well. This on the bottom right here, we've got Daniel Smith's grave in the churchyard at Churchill, and on the bottom left, that's the one of the smallest museums in the country. That's the chancel of the church there, and that's got a superb display on William Smith inside it. And then at the top, we've got the famous William Smith monument, which has on it the father of British geology, and it was erected by this gentleman, the 3rd Earl of Ducie, and I'll come back to him in a little while. There's some now great local literature on it. The late Ralph Mann did this lovely history of Churchill and Sarsden, and when that was published, again, I know Ralph had spent many hours actually in the libraries of the university, putting this together. And we've also put together some village trails around Churchill, highlighting some of the important areas around there and the beautiful countryside you can pass through. This was actually the demolished church in 1823. Some people thought it had fallen down as a ruin, but no, it hadn't. It was actually being demolished. And you can see the chancel at the end. That's the bit that remains today and is currently the museum. But don't be don't sort of fall into the trap of thinking you can just Google William Smith. This is someone told me that this is actually a plaque that's up in Witney, and it is to a William Smith, but he was the great mop maker rather than the great map maker of Oxford. And it was actually unveiled by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, came and did this. But I always thought, yeah, dealing with the wrong William Smith, you should actually sort of look at the real William Smith. Come over to Churchill. And he actually didn't live very, very far away from Churchill. I'm sure he did actually visit there on a few times. But anyway, don't be fooled by just Googling William Smith. Again, a lot of things here you're familiar to you. Some of the busts which are around this. There's obviously the one over in the church at Mayfair, and the one in the Natural History Museum in Oxford. There is another one, bottom right-hand corner, we've got the Geological Society display. So the two maps side by side, William Smith's map on the right-hand side and George Bellis Greenoff's on the left-hand side, and the little bust of Smith shown there as well. This was unveiled in Buckingham Street. This is the property that Smith was evicted from. This was unveiled by Sir David Attenborough in 2015, again marking the 200 years of the map. And it took quite a while to get this. Rather than a blue plaque, it was a green plaque. But yes, Smith is at least commemorated here in this building, which is probably a modern building standing on the site of where his offices used to be. Artworks dominate a lot of the area. This is a very nice sort of couple of big giant vases put together, called Strata. They're commissioned by West Oxford District Council to represent some of the, or to reflect some of the history of the county, done by a very a local sort of craftsman. They are incredibly nice to look at, and they're on display in the museum as well. I was very fortunate enough to work with a South African artist who came over in 2015. She wanted to do these giant artworks which are displayed in a lot of banks in South Africa or corporate buildings. And what she wanted to do was all the paints she wanted to use on these were actually made from the crushed rocks that Smith had identified. So we had to go around the county collecting Oxford clay and limestones and various things, so that Janetta could crush it up to make her paints. There's Smith's sort of silhouette shown on the engineering group of the Geological Society. Again, sort of reflecting his engineering heritage. And of course, the Geological Society also has an annual meetings, the William Smith meetings, and they've now created a William Smith medal, which goes to noteworthy people. I've already touched on the Rotunda Museum in Scarborough, but this received a very large Heritage Lottery Fund award, and so is absolutely superb. This frieze that you see on the bottom right, that was originally done by John Phillips, and a lot of the fossils used to be displayed in it. So let's just spend a couple of slides looking at the William Smith Monument in Churchill. This is about 3 or 4 meters high, and it's got this plaque on the top that says William Smith, the father of British geology, born in Churchill, died in Northampton, erected by the 3rd Earl of Ducie in 1891. And it was always that date and that name of that the person who sort of erected this that was sort of rather confusing. Of course, 1891 doesn't mean anything as far as Smith's work goes or his life. And who was the 3rd Earl of Ducie? Well, here he is. Henry John Reynolds Morton, 3rd Earl of Ducie. This is his official Royal Society portrait that is available. And he was sometime resident in this house. His actually ancestral home is over in Gloucestershire, a place called Tortworth. But he married the daughter of the local squire, James Langston, and she sort of inherited this house after he died. And so he obviously had come over to the village and seen that, you know, and recognized what Smith had done. But that isn't really the full story, because this really sort of is the full story. This is a geological map of the island of Malta. Again, many of you may have been there. This map was actually done by the 3rd Earl of Ducie in the 1850s. And it's his only contribution to geology, because he was really known as an arbor. What was it? Well, he had an arboretum, and he used to grow exotic trees. And anyone who visited him at Tortworth was usually given a tree. But anyway, he'd done this geological map when he'd visited Malta. And it was published in a rather obscure journal or book in the 1870s. But I think it was his mapping of Malta, which when he came back to the UK and Oxfordshire, he realized how important Smith was and thought he should be recognized. And so I will erect this monument to Smith in the village where he was born. Other great things which have happened now, obviously all the archives are available online, and you can go online and see all the diaries and absolutely everything, way more than Cox could have seen during his work on Smith. And then this is the Strata Smith link, which is where a lot of the maps are. And what they've done is they've taken various copies of the map. So you can open up 2 maps and compare what his 1815 map, as I've done here, with the 1828 map. So when Smith was working on this, these were obviously always works in progress that he was doing. There was no sort of, oh, I've done one edition of it, I'll wait for that to sell out and do it. Every map is sort of slightly different, and someone has gone through and now graded a lot of these, and there is a key to go with it. And yeah, here's the 2 major books which have come out now. Smith's Fossils Reunited, that is the one that contains the pictures of all the fossils which are out there. And Strata Smith, I would thoroughly recommend that to anyone who is interested in Smith. It's a very, very good book. on discussing the map, including the county maps and the sections. Really good source of reference. Look, there's even a crater on Mars named after William Smith, but it's not a particularly large crater and it's right at the southern hemisphere, but it was done in 1973. So, you know, at least he sort of got some recognition in the planetary system now. So this is his lasting legacy. What was he? Well, he was a canal builder and land drainer and the sea defense engineer. This mineral prospector and surveyor. He did all of that and he recognized the ordering of strata. And in doing this on his map, he actually enabled people to see something three-dimensionally, but is shown on a two-dimensional way. So with his maps and his sections, he really was years ahead of his time and possibly not given the sort of due respect by the scientific community at the time that he should have been. Thankfully, that is now being addressed, readdressed by what's happening today. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to people who have helped me. This is a picture of my good friend, the late Alan Watkins, who was the historian. So we sat out both by the monument, and I should say we sat in the checkers as well, discussing William Smith and what had happened to why this third Earl of Ducie should have done this. And it was through discussions with Dr. Goodwin de Bono in the University of Malta that I actually sort of managed to unravel this story. I've got the local Churchill and Sarsden Historical Society people who have been really helpful to me, and it's been a great pleasure working with them on things. And then a couple of people from the Geological Society who provided me with scans of their maps, which are superb. And my colleagues here at Oxford, Mike Searle, Tony Watts, Bruce Lavelle, and my room colleague here, Dave Sampson, who's done a lot of drafting for me on various things. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. I will answer any questions that you may have on it if I can. Thanks very much. Thank you, Jane.